She's a burden, my daughter-in-law whispered just loud enough for me to hear. Don't worry, I'll have her out of the house soon. I was standing less than 5 feet away from my son's casket when she said it, my gloved hands resting on the polished wood as if I could still feel some trace of him through it, as if the warmth of his life hadn't already vanished from this world entirely. The church was filled with soft murmurs and the faint scent of lilies, the kind Michael used to buy me every Mother's Day without fail, even when he was a struggling college student counting every dollar. Now those same flowers surrounded him in stillness, arranged too perfectly, too final, while people in black moved quietly around me, offering condolences that felt rehearsed and distant. I didn't turn when I heard her. I didn't react at all. I simply adjusted the ribbon on one of the floral arrangements, smoothing it with careful fingers as if that small act still mattered. It was the only thing I could control in that moment. Vanessa stood behind me, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor, her voice returning to its usual polished sweetness as she greeted guests, thanking them for coming, accepting sympathy as though she were the one who had carried Michael for 9 months, as though she had been there for every scraped knee, every sleepless night, every quiet victory and silent heartbreak that shaped the man he became. I kept my eyes on the casket, on him, on the son I had raised alone after his father passed, the boy who used to hold my hand crossing the street even when he was already taller than me, who promised me once, at 17, that no matter what happened, I would never be alone. The memory flickered through my mind like a fragile light, easily extinguished by the cold weight of the present. Around me, conversations shifted, subtle glances passed between relatives and acquaintances, and I could feel it without looking. Vanessa had already begun positioning herself as the center of everything. She directed the funeral staff with quiet authority, corrected small details in the service as though she owned the entire event, and spoke to people in a tone that suggested she had already stepped into a role that was never hers to begin with. I noticed the way she referred to the house when speaking to Michael's colleagues. It's going to need some updates, she said lightly. I'll probably make a few changes once things settle down. Not our house. Not even his house. Just something she had already claimed in her mind. I heard it all. Every word. Every implication. And still, I said nothing. I reached forward and straightened the edge of the white cloth draped beneath the casket, my movements slow and deliberate, as if time itself had thickened around me. People probably thought I was in shock. Maybe I was. But beneath the stillness, something else was forming. Something quieter, colder, and far more certain than grief alone. Vanessa's laughter drifted toward me again, soft and controlled, followed by another murmur I couldn't quite make out, though I didn't need to hear it to understand the tone. I had lived long enough to recognize it. The subtle shift from courtesy to calculation. The way respect fades when someone believes you no longer matter. I had seen glimpses of it before, in small moments I dismissed at the time. Missed phone calls, shortened visits, decisions made without including me. Little things. Things a mother tells herself not to overthink. But standing there, with my son lying silent before me, those fragments aligned into something undeniable. I finally lifted my hand from the casket, letting it rest at my side, and for a brief second, I allowed myself to breathe in deeply, steadying the ache in my chest that threatened to rise. I would not break here. Not in front of her. Not today. Someone approached me then, placing a gentle hand on my arm, offering words I barely registered. I nodded politely, thanked them, and remained composed, every movement measured, every expression controlled. Across the room, Vanessa caught my eye for a fleeting moment. She smiled. It was the same smile she had worn since the service began. Perfect, practiced, empty. I returned a faint nod, nothing more. If she expected anger, she would not find it. If she expected weakness, she would have to look elsewhere. Because while she believed she had already decided my place in this family, she had made one very simple mistake. She assumed my story had ended the moment my son's did, and she had no idea how wrong she was. I returned home just before sunset, the sky painted in soft shades of gray and fading gold, the kind of quiet evening Michael used to appreciate after a long day, when he would loosen his tie and sit at the kitchen table while I poured him a cup of coffee he never really needed but always accepted anyway. The house felt different the moment I stepped inside, not unfamiliar, but hollow in a way that pressed against my chest with each breath. His shoes were still by the door, slightly scuffed from use, and his jacket hung neatly on the rack, as if he might walk back in at any moment and reach for it without a word. I closed the door gently behind me, careful not to make unnecessary noise, as though the silence itself deserved respect. Vanessa entered a few minutes later, her footsteps sharper now that we were no longer surrounded by watchful eyes and polite voices. She placed her handbag on the counter with a soft thud and exhaled as if the day had been an inconvenience rather than a farewell. "I am exhausted," she said, not to me, but into the room, as though it were expected to respond. I nodded slightly and moved toward the sink, rinsing my hands slowly, watching the water run clear over my fingers. The routine grounded me. It always had. Behind me, I could hear her moving through the kitchen, opening cabinets, closing drawers, her presence filling the space in a way that felt different from Michael's. He had always moved with a kind of quiet respect for the home. Vanessa moved like someone taking inventory. "We are going to need to make some changes," she said after a moment, her tone casual but deliberate. "This place is too large for just one person." I dried my hands with a towel and folded it neatly before placing it back where it belonged. I did not turn to face her immediately. Instead, I looked at the kitchen table, at the faint marks left behind from years of meals, conversations, and ordinary moments that now felt impossibly distant. "I have lived here for over 30 years, I said calmly. "I know how to take care of it." There was a brief pause, just long enough for the air between us to shift. When I finally turned, Vanessa was leaning against the counter, arms crossed lightly, her expression composed but firm. "That is not really the point," she replied. "It is about what makes sense moving forward." Moving forward. The phrase lingered in the room like something rehearsed, something she had already decided before today even began. I studied her face for a moment, noticing the small details I had overlooked before. The slight tightening around her eyes, the way her lips curved just enough to soften her words without changing their meaning. It was not cruelty in the obvious sense. It was something quieter, more efficient. I walked past her without another word and made my way toward the living room, where the late afternoon light filtered through the curtains Michael had insisted on choosing himself years ago. I sat down slowly, folding my hands in my lap, allowing the stillness to settle around me. From the kitchen, I could hear her speaking on the phone in a low voice, her words indistinct but purposeful. Occasionally, a phrase slipped through. "Yes, soon. It will not take long. I will handle it." I did not need to hear the rest. I closed my eyes briefly, letting the sound fade into the background as memories surfaced in its place. Michael standing in that very room, laughing at something I could no longer recall. The way he used to check on me before leaving for work, always asking if I needed anything, even when he was already running late. Small things. Ordinary things. The kind that do not seem important until they are all that remain. When I opened my eyes again, the room looked the same, but something inside me had shifted. The grief was still there, steady and unrelenting, but beneath it was a clarity I had not felt before. Vanessa's voice grew louder for a moment before the call ended, followed by the sound of her footsteps approaching. She stopped in the doorway, watching me as if trying to measure something she could not quite define. "We will talk about arrangements tomorrow," she said. "There are decisions that need to be made." I nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. She waited, perhaps expecting more, but when nothing came, she turned and walked away. The house fell quiet again, the kind of silence that reveals rather than conceals. I sat there for a long time, listening to it, understanding it. She believed time was on her side. She believed I would bend, that grief would make me smaller, easier to move, easier to erase. But she did not understand something that Michael had always known. I do not break the way people expect me to. I never have, and this time would be no different. I woke before sunrise the next morning, not because I had rested, but because the house no longer held the same rhythm it once did. For years, my mornings had been shaped by Michael's routine, the soft sound of his footsteps, the quiet hum of the coffee maker, the brief exchange of words before the day began. Now there was nothing, just stillness. I lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling, listening to the silence as if it might tell me something I had not yet understood. Eventually, I rose, folding the blanket with the same care I had practiced my entire life, smoothing out the corners until everything looked exactly as it should. Order mattered, especially now. In the kitchen, I prepared coffee for one, measuring it precisely, pouring it into the same cup I had used for years. The chair across from me remained empty, untouched, and I did not look at it for long. I did not allow myself to linger there. From upstairs, I heard movement. Vanessa. Her steps were lighter this morning, almost energized, as though something had shifted in her favor overnight. When she entered the kitchen, she was already dressed, her appearance composed, her expression focused. She glanced at me briefly before opening the refrigerator, scanning its contents as if evaluating what belonged and what did not. "I made a few calls this morning," she said, reaching for a bottle of water. "There are some excellent senior communities nearby. Very comfortable. Full services. It would be a better fit." I took a slow sip of my coffee before setting the cup down gently on the table. "I am not moving," I said, my voice calm and even, the words landing without force but with certainty. She did not respond immediately. Instead, she closed the refrigerator door and turned to face me fully, her expression tightening just slightly, enough to reveal the impatience beneath her composure. "This is not about what you want," she replied. "It is about what makes sense. This house is too much for you now. It is not practical." Practical. Another word chosen carefully. Another attempt to make the decision sound reasonable. I studied her for a moment, noticing how comfortable she had become speaking this way, how easily she stepped into a position that had never been hers. "Michael never mentioned anything about me leaving," I said. It was not a question. It was a statement. Her gaze flickered for just a second before she looked away, reaching for her phone as if the conversation had already ended in her mind. "Michael is not here anymore," she said. "Things are different now." The words settled into the room, heavy but expected. I did not react. I simply reached for the newspaper on the table, unfolding it slowly, my hands steady despite the quiet tension that filled the space between us. She watched me for a moment longer, perhaps waiting for resistance, for emotion, for something she could use. When none came, she turned and walked toward the hallway, her heels echoing softly against the floor. A few minutes later, I heard the front door open and close. The house returned to silence. I lowered the newspaper but did not read a single word. Instead, I sat there, considering everything that had been said and everything that had not. Her certainty, her timing, the way she spoke as if decisions had already been finalized. It was not grief guiding her actions. It was planning. Careful, deliberate planning that had not begun yesterday. My eyes drifted toward the hallway, toward the small desk Michael used when he worked from home. It was still as he had left it, papers neatly arranged, a pen resting beside a closed folder I did not recognize. I stood slowly and walked toward it, my steps quiet against the hardwood floor. For a moment, I hesitated. Then I reached out and touched the edge of the folder, feeling the weight of it beneath my fingers. It was not large, not heavy, but something about it felt significant, as though it had been waiting. I opened it carefully, revealing a set of documents neatly organized inside. Legal language, signatures, dates. My eyes moved across the page, taking in each detail with growing clarity. I did not rush. I did not react. I simply read. When I finished, I closed the folder just as carefully as I had opened it and placed it back exactly where it had been. The house was quiet again, but it no longer felt hollow. It felt still, controlled, as if something had shifted into place beneath the surface, unseen but undeniable. I returned to the kitchen and picked up my coffee, now lukewarm, and took another sip without concern. Outside, the morning light had fully broken through the clouds, casting a steady glow across the room. Vanessa believed she was preparing the next step. She believed she was moving forward without obstacles. I sat there in the quiet, my hands resting calmly on the table, and understood something she did not. She had already stepped into a story she did not control. The rest of that morning passed with a quiet precision I had not felt in years, as if every movement I made carried a clarity that had been buried beneath routine and habit for far too long. I cleaned the kitchen, wiping down the counters, aligning everything exactly as it had always been, not because it needed to be done, but because it reminded me of who I was before everything shifted. Before I started overlooking small changes. Before I began excusing things that did not feel right. By noon, the house was still again, the kind of stillness that no longer felt empty, but observant. I walked slowly through each room, taking in the details I had stopped noticing. The framed photos along the hallway, the ones Vanessa had never asked about, never paused to look at. Michael at 8 years old, holding a baseball glove too large for his hand. Michael at 16, standing awkwardly in a suit before his first school dance. Michael at 30, smiling beside Vanessa on their wedding day, a smile I now realized held something restrained, something careful. I stopped in front of that photo longer than I intended, studying his expression as if I might understand something now that I had missed then. He had always been thoughtful, even as a child, observant in ways that reminded me of his father. He noticed when things were not said, when something felt slightly off. And yet, he rarely confronted it directly. He adapted. He adjusted. He carried things quietly. I moved on, continuing toward the living room, where the light had shifted again, casting long shadows across the floor. The house had not changed. Not really. But my understanding of it had. Every detail now felt like part of a larger picture I had only just begun to see. In the early afternoon, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway broke the silence. I did not look out the window. I already knew it was her. The front door opened a moment later, followed by the familiar sound of her heels crossing the entryway. She paused briefly when she saw me standing in the living room, as if surprised to find me there, as if she had expected me to retreat somewhere smaller, quieter, easier to manage. "I spoke with a realtor," she said, removing her sunglasses and placing them carefully on the table, "just to get an idea of the market. It is a good time to sell." I nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, the same way one might respond to a passing comment that holds no real weight. She watched me, her gaze narrowing slightly, searching for a reaction that never came. "You should start thinking about what you want to take with you," she continued. "There is no need to hold on to everything." I let a few seconds pass before responding, allowing the silence to settle between us in a way that felt deliberate rather than uncertain. "There are things in this house that do not belong to you," I said calmly. Her expression shifted, just slightly, enough to reveal the tension beneath her composure. "Everything here was Michael's," she replied. "And now?" She stopped herself, perhaps realizing she had said too much too quickly. I held her gaze for a moment, steady and unyielding, before turning away and walking toward the hallway. I did not need to finish that sentence for her. I already knew how she intended it to end. Upstairs, I entered Michael's office, closing the door softly behind me. The air inside was still, untouched, carrying the faint scent of paper and wood polish. I moved toward the desk again, my eyes settling on the folder I had returned earlier. This time, I opened it without hesitation. The documents were exactly as I remembered. Clear, direct, intentional. My name appeared more than once, each instance placed with purpose, each line reinforcing something I had not fully allowed myself to believe until now. Michael had not been careless. He had not been unaware. He had seen more than he let on. I traced one line. With my finger, reading it again, slower this time, letting the meaning settle fully into place. It was not just about ownership. It was about protection, about conditions, about consequences. I closed the folder and exhaled quietly, not out of relief, but out of recognition. For the first time since the funeral, I felt something steady beneath the grief. Not anger, not sadness, something sharper, something certain. Downstairs, I could hear Vanessa moving through the house again, her voice on the phone, confident, assured, already speaking as if the outcome had been decided. I stood there for a moment longer, the folder resting securely in my hands, before placing it back exactly where it belonged. Then I turned, opened the door, and stepped into the hallway with the same calm composure I had carried all day. She believed she was preparing me to leave. She believed I would quietly step aside. But she had overlooked something that could not be rearranged or removed. This house did not simply hold memories. It held decisions that had already been made long before today. And soon, she would understand exactly what that meant. The afternoon settled into a quiet rhythm that felt almost deceptive, as if the house itself was waiting for something to unfold. I moved through my usual routines with deliberate calm, folding laundry, arranging dishes, placing everything exactly where it belonged, not out of habit, but out of intention. Each action grounded me, kept my thoughts clear, steady, controlled. From the living room, I could hear Vanessa speaking again, her tone confident, measured, the kind of voice people use when they believe they are already in control of the outcome. I did not need to hear every word to understand the direction of her plans. "Yes, I think we can move quickly," she said at one point, her voice carrying just enough to reach me. "There should not be any complications." I paused for a brief moment, my hand resting on the edge of the counter, before continuing with what I was doing. No complications. That was what she believed. That everything would proceed exactly as she expected, that I would remain quiet, cooperative, easy to remove. Later that afternoon, she entered the kitchen again, this time with a folder of her own, thin but purposeful. She placed it on the table with a soft, controlled motion and looked at me with the same composed expression she had worn all day. "I have started putting together some options for you," she said. "Places that would be more suitable, smaller, easier to manage." I glanced at the folder but did not reach for it. "I appreciate your effort," I replied calmly, though there was no warmth in my voice, only clarity. "But it is not necessary." She exhaled slowly, as if preparing herself for a conversation she believed she should not have to repeat. "You are not understanding the situation," she said. "This house cannot stay the way it is. There are expenses, responsibilities. It is not realistic." I met her gaze steadily, allowing a brief silence to settle between us before I spoke again. "You are right," I said. "It is not realistic to make decisions about something that is not yours." The words were simple, but they landed with quiet precision. For a moment, she said nothing. Her expression did not change dramatically, but there was a shift, subtle and unmistakable, like a surface that had just begun to crack beneath pressure. "Everything here belonged to Michael," she replied, her voice firmer now. "And I am his wife." I nodded once, acknowledging her statement without conceding anything. "Yes," I said. "You are." I turned away then, reaching for a glass and filling it with water, taking a slow sip as if the conversation had already ended. Behind me, I could feel her watching, waiting for more, for resistance, for explanation. But I offered none. There was no need. The truth did not require urgency. It required timing. She remained there for a few seconds longer before picking up her folder again, her movements sharper now, less controlled than before. Without another word, she left the kitchen, her footsteps echoing down the hallway with a tension she could no longer fully conceal. I stood there quietly, the glass still in my hand, listening as the front door opened and closed once more. When the house fell silent again, I set the glass down and allowed myself a single, measured breath. Not relief, not satisfaction, just awareness. The kind that comes when everything finally aligns. I walked back toward the living room and sat down in my usual chair, folding my hands in my lap, my posture relaxed but deliberate. Outside, the light had begun to fade, casting long shadows across the floor, stretching the room into something quieter, more reflective. I thought about Michael then, not with the sharp ache of earlier, but with a steady understanding that had taken its place. He had seen this coming. Not every detail, perhaps, but enough to act. Enough to ensure that what mattered would not be undone by assumption or ambition. I leaned back slightly, my gaze resting on the far wall where his photograph hung, his expression captured in a moment of calm confidence that now felt intentional. "You knew," I said quietly, not expecting an answer, but understanding one had already been given. The house remained still around me, unchanged in its structure but entirely different in its meaning. Vanessa believed she was arranging my future. She believed she was preparing me to leave behind everything I had built over a lifetime. But she had built her certainty on something fragile, on the assumption that silence meant surrender, on the belief that time would favor her without question. I sat there as the evening settled in, my hands steady, my thoughts clear, and understood that what she was preparing for was not the future she imagined. It was something else entirely. Something she would not be able to control once it began. The next morning arrived with a quiet certainty that felt different from the days before, as if something unseen had already begun to move into place. I woke at the same hour, followed the same routine, and yet nothing felt uncertain anymore. The air in the house was still, but no longer heavy. It was steady, intentional. I dressed carefully, choosing a simple navy blouse and slacks, the kind of outfit I had worn for years when something important needed to be handled properly. Downstairs, the kitchen was empty. Vanessa had not returned the previous night, which did not surprise me. She was likely continuing her conversations, aligning her plans, preparing for what she believed would be a simple transition. I poured myself coffee and sat at the table, not rushing, not hesitating, allowing each moment to unfold at its own pace. At exactly 9:15, there was a knock at the door. Not tentative, not uncertain, precise. I stood, walked to the entryway, and opened it without delay. Jonathan Reed stood on the porch, his posture straight, his expression composed in the way of someone accustomed to delivering information that changes lives. He removed his hat slightly as a gesture of respect. "Mrs. Brooks," he said, his voice calm and measured. "I hope I am not arriving too early." "You are right on time," I replied, stepping aside to let him in. He entered quietly, taking in the house with a brief glance that lingered just long enough to acknowledge its significance without intruding on it. "I understand this is not an easy time," he continued as we moved toward the living room. "But your son was very clear about the importance of timing." I nodded, gesturing for him to sit. "He always was," I said. Jonathan placed a leather portfolio on the table in front of him, opening it with careful precision. There was no rush in his movements, no unnecessary gestures, only a deliberate unfolding of what had already been decided. "Your son updated his will 6 months ago," he said. He also included a supplemental document with specific conditions regarding the distribution of his estate. I listened without interruption, my hands resting calmly in my lap, my expression unchanged. "He anticipated potential disputes," Jonathan continued, "and he wanted to ensure that his intentions would be carried out exactly as written." The room remained quiet except for his voice, steady and controlled, each word placed with purpose. "There is a clause," he added, pausing briefly as if to allow the weight of it to settle before continuing. "Any beneficiary who attempts to remove you from your residence, or who demonstrates conduct that can be reasonably interpreted as coercive or disrespectful toward you, forfeits their claim to the estate." I did not react outwardly, though the clarity of it settled firmly into place within me. "He was very specific," Jonathan said. "He used the phrase, 'My mother's dignity is not negotiable.'" For a moment, neither of us spoke. The words lingered in the room, not as something new, but as confirmation of what I had already begun to understand. "There is more," Jonathan continued, turning a page within the portfolio. "Ownership of the house transfers entirely to you, effective immediately upon the reading of the will. Additionally, all financial assets tied to the property are protected under the same condition." I inclined my head slightly, acknowledging the information without emotion, without surprise. "And Vanessa?" I asked, my voice even. Jonathan closed the portfolio slowly, his expression unchanged. "Her eligibility is conditional," he said. "If she remains compliant with the terms outlined, she retains a portion of the estate. If not, she receives nothing." The silence that followed was not empty. It was complete. I stood then, walking to the window, looking out at the quiet street beyond, the same street where Michael had once ridden his bicycle in uneven circles, where he had learned to balance, to fall, and to stand again without assistance. "He thought of everything," I said softly. Jonathan did not respond immediately, but when he did, his voice carried a quiet respect. "He thought of you," he said. I nodded once, then turned back toward him, my posture straight, my expression calm. "When will the will be read?" I asked. "Tomorrow morning," he replied. 10 o'clock. All parties have been notified." I held his gaze for a moment before giving a small, deliberate nod. "Good," I said. "Then we will proceed as planned." Jonathan gathered his documents, closing the portfolio with the same careful precision he had opened it. As he stood, he paused briefly. "Your son trusted your strength," he said. "He made that very clear." I offered a faint, controlled smile, the kind that does not seek reassurance but acknowledges truth. "He was right to do so," I replied. Jonathan inclined his head once more before making his way to the door. When he left, the house returned to silence, but it was no longer the silence of absence. It was the silence of certainty. I remained standing by the window for a moment longer, my hands resting lightly at my sides, my thoughts steady and clear. Vanessa believed she was preparing to take control. She believed the outcome was already decided. Tomorrow, she would finally understand the difference between assumption and reality. The morning of the reading arrived with a stillness that felt almost deliberate, as if the world itself had chosen to pause before something inevitable unfolded. I dressed with the same care as the day before, smoothing the fabric of my blouse, adjusting the collar with steady hands, each movement measured and precise. There was no uncertainty left in me now, only clarity. Vanessa returned just before 9, her presence announced by the sharp sound of the front door closing and the quick, purposeful rhythm of her steps across the floor. She entered the living room without hesitation, already dressed in a tailored black outfit that suggested control, composure, and quiet authority. Her eyes found me immediately, scanning my expression as though searching for signs of weakness, of hesitation, of surrender. She found none. "We need to leave in 15 minutes, she said, her tone efficient, as if she were managing a schedule rather than stepping into something that would define the rest of her life. I nodded once, rising from my chair without urgency, without resistance. "I will be ready," I replied. There was a brief pause, just long enough for her to register that I was not asking questions, not seeking reassurance, not engaging in the way she expected. She turned away first, reaching for her phone, already checking messages, already moving ahead in her mind. The drive to the attorney's office was quiet. Vanessa focused on the road, her posture straight, her movements controlled, but there was an energy beneath it now, something sharper than before. Anticipation. Confidence. She believed she understood how this would unfold. She believed she had already positioned herself correctly. I sat beside her, my hands resting lightly in my lap, watching the familiar streets pass by without distraction. Each turn, each stoplight, each quiet moment between us carried its own weight, but I did not fill the silence. I did not need to. When we arrived, the building stood exactly as it always had, modest, orderly, unremarkable to anyone who did not understand what decisions were made within its walls. Vanessa parked the car with a controlled motion and stepped out immediately, adjusting her coat as she did. I followed at my own pace, neither slow nor hurried, simply steady. Inside, the receptionist greeted us with a polite smile, her tone respectful, her eyes briefly lingering on me with a softness that suggested she understood more than she said. "They are expecting you," she said, gesturing toward the conference room. Vanessa walked ahead, her heels clicking against the floor with renewed certainty. I entered behind her, taking in the room with a single glance. Jonathan Reed was already seated at the far end of the table, his portfolio placed neatly in front of him. 2 additional chairs were occupied by distant relatives, their expressions subdued, their presence quiet but observant. Vanessa chose her seat without hesitation, positioning herself close to Jonathan, as if proximity alone would secure her place. In what was to come, I took the chair opposite her, my posture relaxed, my hands resting calmly on the table. Jonathan looked up as we entered, offering a brief nod. "Thank you for coming," he said. His voice was steady, neutral, carrying no hint of what was about to unfold. Vanessa inclined her head slightly, her expression composed, but there was a flicker of expectation in her eyes now, something sharper than politeness. She was ready, or at least, she believed she was. The room settled into silence as Jonathan opened his portfolio, the sound of paper shifting softly against the stillness. "We will begin," he said, his tone formal, measured. Vanessa leaned back slightly, her shoulders relaxing just enough to suggest confidence rather than tension. She crossed one leg over the other, her hands resting neatly in her lap, her gaze fixed forward with quiet assurance. I remained still, my attention focused not on her, but on Jonathan, on the words that were about to be spoken, on the moment that would separate assumption from reality. Time seemed to slow, not dramatically, but just enough for every detail to sharpen. The faint hum of the air conditioning, the subtle shift of someone adjusting in their seat, the quiet breath Vanessa drew, steady and controlled. She believed she was stepping into confirmation, into validation, into the future she had already imagined. I sat there without movement, without expression, understanding something she did not. This was not the beginning of her control. It was the beginning of its end. Jonathan adjusted the documents in front of him with deliberate precision, allowing a brief pause to settle over the room before he began to read, his voice steady and formal as he outlined the opening statements, the customary acknowledgments, the legal structure that framed everything that followed. Vanessa remained still across from me, her posture composed, her expression controlled, though I could see the faint anticipation in the way her fingers rested lightly against her knee, tapping once before going still again. She was waiting for confirmation, for validation, for the moment when everything she believed would finally be spoken out loud. I did not look at her. I kept my attention on Jonathan, listening carefully, not because I did not already understand what was coming, but because I respected the weight of the moment. All personal assets, financial holdings, and real property, Jonathan continued, his voice even, are to be distributed in accordance with the terms outlined in the primary document and its attached conditions. Vanessa's posture shifted slightly at that, her shoulders relaxing just enough to suggest confidence rather than tension, as though she had heard exactly what she expected to hear. The room remained quiet, every sound muted beneath the steady cadence of Jonathan's voice. Then he turned a page. It was a small movement, almost insignificant, but it marked a shift that could not be undone. The residence located at Brookfield Lane, he said, reading clearly, is to be transferred in full ownership to Mrs. Evelyn Brooks, effective immediately. The words settled into the room with a quiet finality. Vanessa did not react at first. There was a brief stillness, a pause that seemed to stretch just long enough for the meaning to register without yet being accepted. Then her gaze shifted, slowly, deliberately, toward Jonathan. "I am sorry," she said, her tone controlled but edged with something sharper. "Could you repeat that?" Jonathan did not hesitate. "The property is transferred entirely to Mrs. Brooks," he repeated. This was specified without exception. Vanessa's fingers tightened slightly against her knee. It was subtle, but unmistakable. "That does not make sense," she replied, her voice still measured, though the calm had begun to thin. "I am his wife." Jonathan inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the statement without altering his tone. "There are additional provisions," he said, turning another page. The room grew quieter still, the air itself seeming to hold its breath. "Any beneficiary named within this will is subject to a conditional clause," he continued. "If said beneficiary engages in conduct that may be reasonably interpreted as coercive, dismissive, or harmful toward Mrs. Evelyn Brooks, they forfeit all claims to the estate, including financial assets and residual property interests." This time, the silence that followed was different. It was not confusion. It was impact. Vanessa's posture changed, not dramatically, but enough. The controlled ease she had carried into the room was gone, replaced by something tighter, more rigid, as though she were holding herself in place by force of will alone. "That is very broad language," she said carefully, choosing each word with precision. "How is that determined?" Jonathan met her gaze evenly. "Based on documented behavior, witness accounts, and direct statements," he replied. "Your husband was very specific in his intent." I remained still, my hands resting calmly on the table, my expression unchanged. I did not speak. I did not need to. Vanessa's eyes moved then, briefly, toward me. Just for a moment. There was no longer confidence in that glance. Only calculation. Rapid, searching, trying to understand how much had been seen, how much had been heard, how much had already been decided without her knowledge. Jonathan continued, his voice unbroken. "Should the conditions of this clause be violated, all assets are to be transferred exclusively to Mrs. Brooks, with no further claim permitted." The words landed with quiet precision, each one reinforcing what had already begun to unfold. Vanessa drew a slow breath, her composure still intact on the surface, but no longer effortless. "I have done nothing inappropriate," she said, her tone firm now, though it carried an undercurrent she could not fully conceal. Jonathan did not respond immediately. He simply closed the document in front of him with measured care. "That is not for me to argue," he said. "It is for the conditions to determine." The room fell silent again, but this time it was not neutral. It was final. Vanessa sat there, her posture still straight, her expression still controlled, but the certainty she had carried into the room was gone. In its place was something far less stable. I sat across from her, unmoving, unaffected, understanding that the moment she had been preparing for had arrived, just not in the way she expected. The silence in the room did not break immediately after Jonathan finished speaking, and that was what made it definitive. Not the words themselves, but the absence of anything that could undo them. Vanessa remained seated across from me, her posture still composed, her shoulders still squared, but the effort behind that composure was no longer hidden. It showed in the slight tension along her jaw, in the way her fingers pressed together just a fraction tighter than before, as though control was no longer something she possessed, but something she was trying to hold on to. I did not look away. I did not shift. I allowed the moment to settle exactly as it was, without interference, without interruption. Jonathan gathered the documents with measured precision, aligning each page as if nothing extraordinary had just taken place, as if this were simply another reading, another conclusion, another legal process carried out exactly as intended. If there are no further questions, he said calmly, we will proceed with filing the final confirmations this afternoon. Vanessa did not respond immediately. When she did, her voice was steady, but it no longer carried the quiet certainty it had before. There must be some kind of misunderstanding, she said. Michael would not have intended for this to be interpreted in such a way. Jonathan met her gaze without hesitation. Your husband's intent was clearly documented, he replied. There is no ambiguity in the language. The words did not rise in volume, did not sharpen in tone, but they closed the space for argument all the same. Vanessa inhaled slowly, her eyes moving briefly toward me again, searching, recalculating, trying to determine what could still be adjusted, what could still be salvaged. But there was nothing left to reposition. The structure she had built her expectations on had already shifted beyond her reach. I rose from my chair then, not abruptly, not with any display of emotion, but with the same calm deliberation I had carried since the beginning. The movement itself seemed to draw her attention more than anything that had been said. She looked up at me, her expression composed but no longer confident. Evelyn, she began, her tone softening just slightly, shifting into something more careful, more considered. We should talk about this. There are details we need to work through together. I regarded her for a brief moment, not with hostility, not with satisfaction, but with clarity. There is nothing to work through, I said quietly. Everything has already been decided. She held my gaze, her expression tightening just enough to reveal the strain beneath her control. I think you are overreacting, she replied. This is just a legal formality. We can come to an arrangement that benefits both of us. I did not respond immediately. I allowed the silence to return, letting it settle between us in a way that made her words feel smaller than she intended them to be. Then I reached for my handbag, lifting it from the table with steady hands. Michael made the arrangement, I said, and I intend to honor it. Jonathan remained seated, observing without interference, his presence steady, neutral, as if he understood that nothing more needed to be added. Vanessa stood then, her movement sharper than before, her composure beginning to fracture at the edges. You cannot expect me to simply accept this, she said, her voice controlled but edged now with something less restrained. I turned toward her fully for the first time since the reading had begun, meeting her gaze without hesitation. You already did, I replied. You just did not realize it. The words did not rise above a calm tone, but they landed with quiet finality. For a moment, she said nothing. The room held still again, but this time it was not anticipation that filled it. It was conclusion. I inclined my head slightly toward Jonathan, acknowledging him with the same composed respect he had shown throughout. Thank you, I said. We will proceed. He nodded once in return. I turned then and walked toward the door, my steps even, unhurried, each movement carrying the weight of something that had already been resolved. Behind me, I could feel her standing there, no longer certain, no longer in control, no longer the center of the outcome she had so carefully anticipated. I did not look back. I did not need to. As I stepped out into the quiet daylight, the air felt different. Not lighter, not easier, but clearer, defined. The kind of clarity that does not come from victory, but from truth finally standing where it belongs. Michael had not raised me to fight loudly. He had taught me something far more lasting than that. He had taught me to stand still when it mattered most. And in the end, that was all it took.